up. So welcome everybody. So from what I can see, we've got 17 people signed in right now, which is great. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us on this RDKB hosted watershed webinar series. It's sort of a science and learning event for the Boundary region. I'm looking to host one of these about once every couple of months. So our next one is actually April 13th. We're looking at wetlands. So I did post a quick poll, and so we'll talk a little bit about it afterwards. But yeah, it's great for us to know, and really also for our attendees to be able to see a little bit about where people are calling in from and some of the information on their thoughts on the riparian and rural environments. So as we begin, I acknowledge the First Nations and Indigenous influence on the Boundary region and the First Nation traditional history here in our boundary watersheds. I respectfully appreciate that the land on which many of us gather on it and is referenced in this webinar is the convergent traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx, Sinixt, Secwepemc peoples, as well as the Métis people who have also touched these lands. We're grateful to have this collective opportunity to share our knowledge and information via this webinar, both from our presenters and our attendees. So many of you have already written in the chat box. And, you know, like I said before, this riparian information, it's really important for our area. And I know the presenters have a strong connection to these areas and the organisms that rely on these riparian environments. So I see us all here today to learn from each other. The attendees, we're asking that, you know, sharing stories, questions. We're really keen on having those questions and input. And the presenters, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and learnings of these environments. I know I'm really looking forward to learning on both sides. So what's the plan? We'll start with, I'll give you a little bit of background on the process here. Natasha Lukey is going to speak about the aquatic riparian health and restoration component of this webinar, and Eric Hegerat, local fisheries and invasive aquatic species. Thank you so much for both of you for coming in. So I'm sort of calling this a part 2 of our riparian discussion. The riparian health and protection, which was our part 1, has been a part of this has been part of the boundary conversation for many years now. Last November, we heard from Jenny and Barb, local biologists with many years of riparian working experience within our boundary region, discussing these areas, why they're important, and mechanisms to protect them. Lee Hesketh, BC Cattlemen's, with the Frisk program, continued that conversation with incorporating the agricultural component and detailed restoration techniques from years of projects, with very interesting before and after photos for any of you that were able to see that presentation as well. It was super interesting. And today, I'm just super excited to be able to tie into all of these discussions. What I see is a really, really important part of this conversation, involving an understanding of these areas, focusing on that aquatic component of the riparian health, restoration, and protection conversation. I'm so excited to have Fisheries Biologist Natasha Lukey from the Okanagan Nation Alliance to speak to us about so many of the different components of the aquatic benefits of these areas, sharing with us her understanding of the many water, land, riparian processes and her experience with restoration of these areas, and how these areas affect organisms that rely on that water, really, and or land environments. And we certainly got those organisms that require both of those components. So she's been in the Okanagan since 2006. Natasha has gained excellent insight into the watersheds just to the west of us. So thank you so much, Natasha, for joining us. I'm excited to hear about your projects. And of course, when you think aquatic, and we'll see Eric in a few minutes here because we had his video working just beforehand. But when you're thinking aquatics, you often think fish. Oh, there's Eric. Hi, welcome. Eric Hegerat is a fisheries biologist with the fisheries section, I'm sure you have a better word for it, in the Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, this is the ministry, the provincial government. And we are so lucky to have such an experienced boundary fisheries person joining us for this discussion. Eric has been working in the boundary region since he started with the ministry, from what I understand, in 2013. And so has really seen firsthand impacts from both that low and high water event, something that really our region has experienced both sides of that spectrum in the last 10 years. So Eric will share with us his local fisheries knowledge, including aquatic invasive species. So both what present and what to watch for, I think is what we're looking for. So Thank you very much to both of you for taking the time to be with us here today. My name is Christina Anderson, watershed planner with the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary. I've been here for about a year and a half and really just excited to be living, working, and playing here in the Boundary region. So the goal of these RDKB webinars is really just to help explore that boundary waterways and watersheds, sharing information and learning. So one of the things that we looked at doing, so I'm just going to end the poll here, is we're sort of keen to find out a little bit about who we have attending. So it looks like we've got 19 participants, says Christina. There we go. 19 participants from the area. So 44%, so just over half of the participants from outside of the boundary, but really close to having that close 50% mark. And we certainly have a couple of people that work in the boundary, but that don't live here. So that's certainly a big part of what we see in this area. And so thank you very much for everybody for joining. So it's a sort of interesting. One of the interesting conversations that I've had with Natasha when we were talking about doing this webinar was speaking to, would you consider yourself in rural or urban environments? And I liked that. I liked that question. Natasha, any comment as to why you thought that was an important part of that conversation?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. Depending on where you live, it kind of shapes your view and your relationship to the land, and how you view various processes that come from rivers and stuff. So it's kind of good to know if you live in a city, and typically if you're in the city, you're super concerned about flood control, but you're also using those rural channelways and pathways that are close in town. So your view of a river, say, is it's a modified view, even though you still have a close, wonderful relationship with it. And then rural, yes, obviously you're still concerned about flooding too, but the perspective is a little bit different in that you're used to seeing a bit bigger and just being around rivers a little bit more. And if you've grown up with that background, you've seen the change and how rivers just naturally shift over time. So it's interesting to see where people are coming from with their backgrounds.
I think that's fantastic. And I think the thing that for me, which was sort of interesting too, is being in small communities, sometimes it's a bit of a mindset, whether somebody may consider you urban. So it's sort of whether you sided more with one or the other, even though somebody maybe from Vancouver would say, oh, everybody's rural and outside of past hope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's kind of a neat, it's that almost that personal mindset. So we have 67% of the people that consider themselves in that rural environment. So that's really interesting. And go. So the other question that I was just going to quickly put on as a poll, and this is sort of course, that typical one with like, how familiar do you think you are in terms of that fisheries component of the boundary watersheds? And I know that I'm learning so much constantly, and it's been pretty neat to see. So I'll just wait a few seconds here on that and let people take the time to answer that question. Oh, we're almost at 73% of the people have responded already. Great. Well, I'm happy to say that everybody at least knew we had fish in the boundary waterways. So that's here we are. So somewhat and not very familiar. So this is going to be a great conversation. Just being able to look at the sort of the big picture of understanding what we have in our waters and yeah, taking this time to all learn from each other. So that's great. So somewhat not familiar, tied, very close, 44% on both. So I'll just really quickly cover off Zoom. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think a lot of people have been pretty tied into Zoom webinars lately. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me at watershedplanner@rdkb.com. If you're sort of looking at it going, I don't understand something about the presentation or the webinar, And I can certainly respond that way. You can also go to the chat box. We're asking sort of the chat box, sort of more of those technical questions. You know, I can't hear, or can somebody please try to repeat something? Just sort of some of that side of it. Q&A box, we're sort of going for the questions. It's really handy to be able to have all those questions together. I do find that sometimes if the questions are in the chat box, I can miss them a bit as the chat box is being used. And what I'll do is I won't interrupt Natasha or Eric unless there's sort of a clarification question that's coming into the presentation. And then we'll have the availability and the time to be able to ask questions at the end. So we'll have a bit of time after Natasha's presentation. And then once Eric is completed, we'll have time for sort of questions for the whole process. So one thing that we're hoping to be able to do, as long as we have enough time, is be able to have people have that opportunity to ask questions themselves, virtually, in person. So all I'd ask is that you raise your hand, so that raise hand imagery button there, and then I'll unmute you on my side. If you want to be on video and be able to show your video, just let me know when you do that, and then I can move you over so that we can get the video capability as well. And so any other questions, feel free to just ask me in the chat box. I'll be watching the chat and the Q&A as we go through. Okay. Natasha, I will pass this over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I really appreciate you offering your time to listen to us today and to learn about the world that we all share. So I understand that not all of us live in the Kootenay boundary region. And like myself, I work for the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and most of my work and life is centered in the South and Central Okanagan and a little bit in the Lower Similkameen. So we, today, the areas we're talking about are spanning over many nations. So we've got the Sinaiks, the Seshwepnik, the Tanaha, and the Syilx Okanagan. And as Christina mentioned, even like the Métis and many bands across Canada have used Southern BC as a really important economic and trading hub. So we are not separate by any means from all the other nations that also traded for the resources here. Okay, so I think I'm going to turn off my camera for a little bit during the slides so I don't get any feedback in my audio. So I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll turn it back on afterwards. There we go. And okay, is my screen being shared currently?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, it's good? We're
Yeah.
good? Okay. And again, before I start, Christine also touched on this as well, but I also wanted to give out a shout to the nations who have used these lands for tens of thousands of years, since time immemorial. Coming from a Western science training background, I'm continuously learning and becoming aware that what we thought was untouched colonial or untouched wilderness at colonization was actually a land that's been stewarded and managed in a really intricate and intimate way for tens of thousands of years. So what we see is because it's been deliberately stewarded and respected into what it is today. So I also want to give a big shout out to thank you for keeping the land so beautiful for us. All right, so we'll start with what is riparian habitat. So riparian habitat is where the land meets the water, and the land and the water are very interconnected. So water aquatic habitat systems cannot thrive without the land and the land's inputs, and vice versa. The land cannot thrive without the water and the water's inputs. So if you can see my mouse, can you see my mouse? Okay, perfect. Another main characteristic of riparian areas is the fluctuating soil moisture level. So the photo on my left here is one of our setback projects in high water, and then the photo on the right is during the low water season when we're out there. So it's very different. The vegetation, we often refer to it as tolerant of low and dry conditions, but I would argue that it requires these low and dry conditions. So riparian vegetation typically will not survive in prolonged periods of wet, nor will it survive in prolonged periods of dry. It really needs that fluctuation. And finally, riparian habitat in a healthy form is super dynamic and super diverse in structure and function. So the schematic on the bottom right here just kind of goes through a very basic, typical kind of textbook riparian area. So you have the main wetted area, whether that be your stream or your lake, and then you start off with low growing sedges, and then you transition into the larger stuff. Okay, so how is riparian habitat formed? And this is really important. To understand and bring back riparian habitat, we really have to understand how it's made to begin with. So riparian habitat is driven by water transport and sediment transport dynamics. Oftentimes, modern humans, we are surprised when a river floods over its banks that we're used to seeing, but really, the job of a river in the world is to do something with water and sediment and turn it into something useful. So the whole point of the river is to take this water volume that is being given and move it in such a way that it creates useful habitat for people, fish, and wildlife. Riparian habitat is typically formed at the 200-year flow. So these are the big flows that change channel courses, and they scour out existing riparian areas and take sediment from one spot and move it to a next spot. The riparian habitat is maintained at the average, we call it the 2-year flow, but that really works out to be about the average annual freshet. So for a few weeks in the spring, we have our big runoff, and this kind of moves sediment, not as big as the big flows, but it keeps it moving enough to maintain things like spawning habitat and gravel bars and riffles and pools and things like that. Oh, I'll just go back. That picture was actually Mission Creek in Kelowna during one of the flows sometime around the mid-1950s, I believe. So lots of water, and in one person's lifetime, chances are they won't see a massive flow like this, but it's actually more common than we think. All right, so riparian habitats they provide us a number of ecosystem services. I've highlighted a lot here, and I'm only going to touch on a few during this presentation. I've tried to focus on the processes that form riparian habitat and how to bring those back, because that is what leads to the wildlife habitat. And there are so many arguments for beautiful fish and frogs and birds. It's a little bit harder to argue for giving water and dirt space. So for fish, wildlife, and people, the diversity in riparian habitat provides diversity in food, medicine, building and shelter materials, moving, so seasonal and annual migration courses, protection from weather extremes by regulating microclimates in our thick riparian buffers, protection from flood and droughts, protection from sediment erosion and deposition, carbon sequestration for climate change. So riparian areas are really good at grabbing that carbon and holding on to it for a long time before they let go. Water filtration and groundwater charge, promoting hyporheic flows, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Harboring beneficial insects such as pollinators, and this is really important for agricultural environments. And providing us improved quality of life in a modern world, so to speak. So the example that comes to mind are frogs, which are typically associated with more the wetland version of riparian areas. But research has shown that even if you think you hate frogs, say you grew up as a child or you're an adult, you move to an area of frogs, and they're really loud. They can be really loud and really disruptive overnight. So even if you think consciously that you hate frogs, when you hear them and you're triggered of thinking of them, your brain actually triggers feelings of nostalgia. So you think you hate them, but really you love them. And there's many economic benefits. I couldn't find the number for the Okanagan River, but it was in the millions. The little tiny riparian habitat that's left on the Osoyoos Indian Band Reserve provides millions of dollars in ecosystem benefits that we otherwise pay for off reserve for things like water filtration and air quality, temperature regulation, and that sort of stuff. One example that came out of Europe when they looked at a broad scale analysis of riparian habitat was total ecosystem service value was significantly increased in restored reaches versus unrestored reaches. And this was a value of $2,140 per hectare per year in the restored reach that had economic benefit over an unrestored reach. And again, economic benefits extend to things like the tourist industry. So riparian areas are really great at pulling people into the shoulder seasons. So once the bulk of people leave in the summer, we still have things like hunting to offer in riparian areas, or supporting, if not directly hunting in riparian areas, supporting animals that are hunted species. Okay. All right, so riparian sediments, soils, and vegetation interactions. So again, this is the driver of riparian areas. These three interact to slow the water's movement through a system. This is also known as increasing water residency time. And it does this by increasing the roughness value in Manning's N. The roughness value is the friction that water experiences as it moves through a surface. So you can imagine grasses have a rougher value than just a straight sand bed, and then trees have an extra big value as opposed to grasses. There's many different ways that water and air are filtered. A lot of it can be catching pesticide drift if we have a buffer big enough, and that protects our pollinators too. There's the hyporheic flow, and that also promotes filtration of the water between the groundwater and the surface water. We recharge our groundwater aquifers, our deeper ones, through riparian areas, and we have storage and uptake of nutrients and pollutants. So an example is cattails are really great at taking up heavy metals, and then the plants take up like the nitrogens and the phosphorus that comes from the river, and then also from the fish, which we'll talk about later. So the hyporheic flows are kind of the interaction between the surface water and then the shallower water underneath and beside a river. The zones can be a few centimeters deep, or they can be a few, like tens of meters deep and wide. Water moves much more slowly through the zone, and it promotes the temporary storage until low flows or the recharging of deeper ground aquifers. In addition to water exchange, gases and nutrients are also exchanged, and carbon and nutrient exchange and processing rates are more effective in this zone versus the faster surface water flows. The picture down on the bottom left is one of our side channel reconnections that we did in the Okanagan River, or in Oliver. So the dark kind of chocolate milk, that is the main stem river, and the clear water is coming from our recently restored side channel. So about 300 meters upstream, the water came into our side channel as dirty as this chocolate milk, and then it exited the side channel nice and fresh, and it provides a really important refuge for fish. So I don't know why the river was so turbid that day, but it's not uncommon in high flow to have turbid water. Okay, let's see. Cottonwood forests. So historically, our valley bottoms were covered with much, much larger swaths of riparian forests. Black cottonwood formed a large portion of this habitat. And black cottonwood is extremely good at absorbing and redistributing water. So at a landscape scale, they absorb and redistribute a massive amount of water daily from the ground or the surface water to the atmosphere. And this kind of plays a little local microclimate regulation factor too. Kind of like if you look at the Amazon rainforest on a large scale, there's like an atmospheric river that moves across the globe. It's really cool. I recommend you look it up, but it's really neat to see how trees can make kind of this river that goes through the air that we can't see, but it definitely helps us. Black cottonwoods also redistribute water through the soil column. So they bring water up through their roots from deeper in the ground and make it available to other plants with shallower root systems. And their canopies reduce temperature, making conditions more favorable in the hot, dry seasons. So when water floods into these cottonwood forests, the roughness factor, which is the friction applied to moving water, is very high. In other words, it's really good at slowing water. Let's see, riparian forests can reduce floodwater velocity, increase water residency time, and increase storage capacity in river systems by up to 70% in one study that was looked at. If you have a healthy riparian forest, more than half of the precipitation falling in a floodplain may be removed via plant transpiration in a restored riparian forest versus a swath of land that doesn't have any riparian vegetation. There's more and more research coming out suggesting that riparian forests might actually be better at mitigating urban floods than stormwater retention ponds. So again, riparian forests, especially near urban areas, are taken out quite a lot. There's a lot of concerns and conceptions that they don't do anything for flooding or they're safety hazards, but in reality, they really, really help us out. So it's important that we focus on bringing back these systems wherever we can. Okay, so another thing people love to hate, which yeah, take it or leave it. Sometimes they've caused us challenges in our projects, and sometimes it really helped us out off the bat. So beaver dams and beavers. So beavers and fish especially are co-evolved. Beavers, in the words of Fairfax and Whittle, they slow it, they spread it, and they store it. So sediment capture, increasing rates of filtration and substance uptake by vegetation, storage into the dry season, in the fire season especially. So just trying to find, in the areas that had riparian vegetation with beavers, when a fire had traveled through, a wildfire, the condition of the riparian habitat was 3 times more robust and healthy in a stream with beavers and riparian habitat versus in a stream with just riparian habitat. So, consideration, riparian habitat is great, but we also have these animals that kind of act synergistically to enhance the impacts of these riparian areas. So these benefits are seen at a greater scale. Yeah, so again, if you're talking about beaver dams, they increase the scale of kind of protection against wildfire versus just a non-beaver system. This also means we have to reserve a river space so it can react to a beaver dam. Beavers do admittedly cause damage when a river is confined and the river has nowhere to go and to play and interact with the beaver dam. So some of the impacts could be fish passage blockage completely. Even though fish and beavers are co-evolved, they still can build their dams to form a passage or to form a barrier. And diversion and breaching dikes, like if dikes are not built properly and strong enough, a river with enough flow can go around a beaver dam. So having the setback dike allows the river to play with a beaver dam and still re-meander, scour, erode, deposit, and do all those lovely processes that keep our mosaic of diverse habitat moving and fish passing through. So the top right is Inconate Creek, and it's really hard to see, but there was a beaver dam, and what happened was a giant mudslide came through, and then there was kind of a knee-jerk reaction, and the creek was kind of formed into a channel by people where it hadn't been channelized before. It was kind of a soft dike, so it wasn't a formal dike, but the beaver dam kind of punched around, the water punched around the beaver dam and reclaimed its setback area anyway. So in the beginning, we were concerned about fish passage. It's an important steelhead creek, but in the end, we're like, well, the river helped, and now we're working with the neighboring landholders to create a proper setback so that the river still can do this into the future while protecting the urban values on the other side of the setback. So a setback doesn't have to take up the whole valley. I definitely don't want to give that impression. Right, so the other beautiful thing about riparian habitats, especially in agricultural landscapes, they harbor pollinator insects. So when I say pollinators, I mean bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, moths, some birds, and some bats. Pollinators are responsible for about just over a third of global crop production. And if you look at a place like China that's lost their pollinators, many of the farms hand pollinate their cherry trees, and that translates to massive losses in economic dollars. So, why would we put all this manpower into something when we can work with the earth and have it help us accomplish our needs? That being said, pollinators are not exactly in the greatest situation. Like, many of them are facing decline, and a lot of this is due to habitat loss and degradation, introduced invasive species, pesticides, disease, and parasites. The riparian buffers offer a refuge from all of the above. I mentioned earlier before capturing pesticide drift. And for this, ideally, so in the schematic from Bentrup and Crew, there is a kind of a conifer tree here. And they've indicated in this diagram that this conifer tree is not an ideal flowering or habitat feature for pollinators. So the job of this tree is to kind of capture the pesticide drift before it hits the riparian and the creek habitat. So again, it's just kind of wrapping our minds around different ways of how we can use, like this conifer tree, for example. It doesn't have to be a native species. We could use indigenous species as long as they're not going to eventually take over in the habitat. So just kind of thinking of new ways to work together with the land. All right, so we have riparian and fish. So I'm really happy that Eric's here to talk today. Our Columbia team is incredibly overworked, so they were not able to give this presentation, so it's a bit less of a local focus than I was hoping for, but Eric is here to back me up and talk about this. So even though what we're moving forward with, they're not exactly local to the Kootenay boundary region. However, the principles are still applicable, and our team still has the ability to do these types of projects. So you can kind of take this and in your mind, in the areas where you're familiar with around your home, kind of think about, we can do, like, together, you, us, whoever, we can do projects like this to bring back the health. And many of the principles are the same. Okay, so riparian areas, particularly for salmon and salmonids, and I don't just mean like steelhead, sockeye, chinook, kokanee, and coho, but also things like rainbow trout. They greatly rely on floodplains. So, for example, kokanee don't use floodplains, but they use the inputs that come from riparian areas, such as a large woody debris input, the insects that fall in as little prey items, shading in the hot spawning season when they're moving upstream. And then the influence that riparian habitat has on a creek's meander and pool riffle sequence system, that also provides habitat for the kokanee by way of spawning habitat and pools for temperature and flow refuge. Again, when rivers have a place to move, the riffles that form as a result oxygenate the water. And when a river can move dynamically, it maintains habitat kind of across the scale of itself and across time. So you may not always find the same riffle in the same spot all the time, but it will move through the system and something will be there. And the fish are really good at keying in and finding that. Nutrients, especially the nitrogen and the phosphorus that come from fish and go to land. So I guess salmon would be the main factor here. Enhance tree stem growth by up to 19%. So in forests that have salmon inputs into them, they're in a geologic scale, they're typically bigger, much bigger than a forest that doesn't have a salmon input. Some macroinvertebrate little water bugs that are indicative of high water quality are also co-evolved to salmonid rivers. And they require water that has a ratio that is very similar to the ratio of phosphorus to nitrogen from a salmon when it breaks down in the water. So they kind of key in on that. So we've done we're 19 years of data on the main fish-bearing streams in the Okanagan River and Lake system. And we've definitely found in areas with riparian habitat, the macroinvertebrates they follow kind of a typical pattern of composition and abundance, which is indicative of good water quality. Let's see here. So for the non-rainbow trout, the non-kokanees, I guess we'd be talking Chinook and steelhead. The production of Chinook and steelhead and their healthy level when they emerge as juveniles is much greater when the rivers have access to floodplains. I shouldn't say when they emerge. They emerge in the spring and then they hit the floodplain. They eat all the bugs, they fatten up, they're protected from the flows, then they carry on the main stem. So I know Chinook and steelhead, Nadgermistan, salmonids in general are not really something that not too many people are familiar with these days in your region. However, historically, these species did occur. So the Christina Lake area, I guess we're talking about kind of down here, right? Am I okay? So salmonids from the ocean weren't common up in this particular little section in here, but there was the odd occurrence. So right now, the Okanagan Nation, the Okanagan Nation, so Secwepemc Nation, the Government of Canada and the Province of BC, with supportive funding by the Columbia Basin Trust, are working to bring back anadromous ocean-going salmon to their historical habitat. So in the future, you'll be hearing a lot more of this, and it's very exciting. So the process right now is just trying to figure out what has happened to these systems after so many years of damming and modification, and how we can help bring them back, and what impacts bringing them back would or could have on species that are here already. So making sure we do it right. So the logo is here for the project. It's called Bringing the Salmon Home. This word, Pelpelktim, is, it means to bring them back, but it also incorporates a human influence. So it's saying we're calling them back, and it's recognizing the integration of how we as people influence the salmon cycle also. The logo, so The logo was 3 artists composed this logo. The one, where's my mouse here? The very, very furthest right, kind of the Chinook with the green back, was created by Darcy Luke from Okanagan Nation. This Chinook salmon design symbolizes the life-giving generational legacy of the salmon. So it's a reminder for all of us in past, present, and future that we are all integrated with this system. The orangest salmon, this little guy here, this is the sockeye, and it is done by Kelsey Jules of Secwepemc Nation. And this design embodies the vital relationship between salmon, land, and water, carrying and communicating this relationship wherever the salmon go. And then the final one was done by seal artist in the middle, Tanka Chikala. And this design is inspired by Seal Chapchik teachings, which is the oral history, illustrating the inseparable connections between salmon and culture. So part of the design includes Senclip, and Senclip is coyote, and coyote brought the salmon throughout the Columbia system from the ocean in a very specific way, depending on how he interacted with the people in the community. So, and the bear paws are, Skemheast is black bear, and that's one of the 4 food chiefs. And Skemheast was one of the animal people who helped people survive when they got here. So very highly respected in this land. So kind of the logo kind of drills home that everything is connected to everything. And this is across space and time also. So again, in order for the water to thrive, the land must thrive, and vice versa. And in order for us and our future generations to thrive, the land and water must thrive now and into the future. So, and this holds true even, like, maybe you're not a nature nut and you don't really care about fish and going out hiking. However, you still have a cell phone, you still have chairs, like every single thing in our modern creature comfort comes from this land. So even if we don't honor it by going and having fun in the land, we still sit on a chair and take something from the land. So for more information, the website was just launched and it's at columbiariversalmon.ca. And there's quite a lot of information if you're interested in more. Okay, so what I didn't mention before, with my job, I'm in the habitat restoration kind of team in the fisheries department, and our overarching guidance is to put back the river, bring back the fish, and put back the people. So my specific task has been to put back wetlands and floodplain river interactions. And a couple of projects that we've done, I haven't been involved in all of these, but I've definitely learned from them. One of them is ORI, the Okanagan River Restoration Initiative in Oliver. And that was initiated, the ORI team has been together for about 20 years. And ORI, the first re-meander here started in 2009, boots on the ground. All right, so there's a number of ways that we can bring back the riparian habitat. Dike setbacks are one of them. Let's see. The main way we can do that is adding complexity, and this doesn't have to be dike setback. It can be various other kind of smaller scale projects within a confined space. They won't be as effective, but they still do help in their own little way. So this is 2 sections of the same river. One is channelized and the other one is still the semi-natural section. And you can just see there's just so much, like there's a little bit of a pool here and glide, and there's some riffles, and there's some like the overhanging vegetation. And the overhanging vegetation was really important in our hot, dry system to shade out that water. So one of our targets is to try and get that overhanging vegetation back. So you saw this picture. This was the Ori picture, but I'll just go into a little bit more detail. This involved 1.13 kilometers of dike setback, and it reconnected 10 acres of historic floodplain. The river meander here was about half, I keep losing my cursor. The bigger river meander was about half a kilometer long, and it was done as a dual split channel, so kind of roughly equal flow in either channel. There was sockeye spawning areas that were constructed, and after these were constructed, there was also natural gravel recruitment for the spawning habitat. So that's kind of a really big success factor, is we kick-started the process, and then the water took it from there. So whenever we get the land doing its processes again on its own, like that's really our target, and it's sometimes hard to do, but it's a really big celebration when you observe it. The second, there's a little bit of side channel that we reconnected just upstream of the main remeander. And then there was some wetland habitat in here that we did. So the way the lay of the land was before restoration, the floodplain was a big agricultural field, and there were some houses there. So there were some farmhouses and just various agricultural stuff. But the elevations were such that when the water inundated, it didn't go everywhere. So we were actually able to create little pocket wetlands for things like fish who don't coexist beside, things like frogs and salamanders who don't like to live in the same water bodies as fish, but still need this type of habitat. So I don't know if you can see down, it says wetland amphibian ponds created in 2014. That's one of the pockets for tiger salamander that we did. And then in the middle, there's some spadefoot pocket wetlands. And then the upper section, there's kind of a little experimental cottonwood riparian forest. So this is some of the after pictures for that. So that is my dear friend Colette. She's standing in what used to be the old dike. So that willow vegetation is completely natural, and it came up the year after we lowered the dike. The picture down below in the bottom left, that's just kind of an island of one of the remeanders. And you can see there there's some natural large woody debris recruitment that occurred, and then some more gravel recruitment. And there were some boulders placed upstream and downstream in strategic locations. And then the bottom right is the side channel to kind of give you an idea of the vegetation that grew around it. And we kept it separate from this pond that's to the left. Let's see if I can get my cursor back. This guy here. So again, we wanted to separate the frogs from the fish. Indigenous fish are not such an issue, but introduced invasive fish, definitely, like bass and carp, will completely decimate an amphibian population. Okay, so that's just another picture. This is another one in Mission Creek in Kelowna, BC, and it is, you can't really tell by this picture, but it is in town, so that the H2O Aquatic Center is right at the bottom, like across the street in the bottom of the picture. But anyway, we set back about half a kilometer of dike, and I think it was about 10,000 meters squared of floodplain habitat that went in. And then there's a couple notches, so we lowered the previous dike in the dark areas here. So this picture is one of the peak flows that went through, and this project was successful at moving the sediment into the floodplain and creating those scour spots that black cottonwood really love. So again, this is some of the before is the top left. Again, agricultural field, fairly dry. Sometimes it had groundwater close to the surface in the spring in a high water year, but generally nothing too major. This was the kind of during, so immediately after we set back the dike in this middle photo here, we took all this salvaged wood that we had to cut down for the dike footprint, and we just kind of installed it in various clumps and perches for wildlife and cover objects. And then this picture on the bottom right is the after 2 years ago, maybe, I think. It's hard to see with this, but the greenery is taller than myself, and it's a lot of black cottonwood and willow. And that was all natural succession. And you can kind of see along this section here, there was some sand and gravel that came in, and it created little areas for cottonwoods to start establishing on. I don't think I mentioned before, but black cottonwoods really, they need disturbance. They're not great competitors, and they really, really like the annual average freshet to come through and just lightly scour their banks or wherever they're growing, and that really encourages them to grow. All right, so this is another one in Penticton. The floodplain that we have been planning for quite a while, but we just got off the construction project last week. So it's brand new, but we're very excited about it. So again, we have a little kind of smaller berm, vegetated berm, we call it, that's contoured for passage for amphibians and frogs. However, it's contoured such that fish can't get in with surface flow. This is the main section targeted at Chinook juveniles, and then we've installed a large culvert in the dike here. The vegetated berm in the green wasn't necessary, but we had a lot of cut material to place, so we kind of placed it along here. Flooding at the 200-year level is not a problem here because the land is so high compared to the river. So even though this height of land before we dug it was the historical elevation of the floodplain, when the channel was dug, it lowered the water table and the ground table by about 3 meters. So in order to get water back into this land, we had to dig. In other areas, you could back water to raise the level up. However, we can't do that in the city of Penticton. We promised that they wouldn't flood. We wouldn't flood them. So this top figure is the before. The middle figure is an initial excavation we did in March of 2020. We dug this before we put the culvert in because we just wanted to make sure that our target inundation with the river, like the groundwater and the river surface water levels, were going to match up as we wanted to, and then we could do adjustment if it didn't work out ideally before we put the culvert in. So top is March 2022, the middle is last summer, and then this bottom picture here is from a week or two ago, and we put a bunch of gravel. So there's a bunch of experimental features we have with this one based on kind of anecdotal evidence, Western literature, traditional ecological knowledge, and like local experience and minds. Our steering committees are composed of people from all different organizations and expertise, experience, and levels. So we have in this one, Okanagan Nation Alliance, Penticton Indian Band, the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Keepers Committee, and the Okanagan Center are kind of the core steering committee. But we also have an advisory committee of the province of BC, and that's the province of BC. So the fisheries, the wildlife ecosystems, and the public protection. Oh, what is the branch? The dike manager, essentially, and the Okanagan Lake level manager. He sits on it as well. The government of Canada. So we have fisheries from DFO, and then Environment Canada. And then we have a number of nonprofits and people from UBCO all sitting around and kind of feeding these projects. So there's a couple of different experimental features. One of them is the gravel that we installed. And we did this to kind of provide separation between indigenous fish species and introduced fish species. So carp really like that grassy, thick, emergent vegetation in a floodplain. And it's a really great area for them to sit and eat other things, which is, of course, a threat to our indigenous fish juveniles. So we're hoping that this kind of creates a little bit of separation in space and time by providing this 20 to 30 centimeter gravel layer. And then the indigenous fish have these cover objects of these large woody debris. And the radius of those root wads is massive, like it's taller than a human. So again, it's all experimental when you work in a crazy world. All right, so moving away from kind of floodplain re-engagement and dike setbacks on kind of the medium to larger scale, you could also recontour a dike from its existing typical structure to have a little bit more contouring along the bank and provide a little bit more diversity in the water, soil moisture, sediment capture areas and things like that. So you can't move a setback. Ideally, you want to do your setback, but this would kind of be the next best step. This was a project that I took a tour of from some folks down in Oregon, and they had just finished doing it again, but they were using tons of large woody debris that was locally salvaged to try and hold back the water and kind of influence that hyporheic flow. All right, and then I think Lee Hesketh might have talked about this. It's a little bit smaller scale again, but it's just stabilizing already what you have to prevent land loss and to prevent loss of any riparian habitat that you have that you don't want to lose and you want to kind of hang on to. So this is in the Similkameen, and we use just the riprap at the 2-year flow level, and above that we put the willow stakes. I don't really have a great before. Oh, there it is. Bottom right is the first before picture, and then this was the next summer, the vegetated pictures. And this is local, Pass Creek. This was one of Amy and teams, and they were doing some plantings to try and supplement the riparian buffer that, so a little bit that had already existed here. It's hard to see, but there are cages around some riparian plantings. And here too, where the buffer was lost, to kind of protect that field from the creek and add some more protection there. All right, and then the final kind of small, I think this is the final, small scale local type of restoration that you could do, and we have done, is installing large woody debris into the main stem, similar to the one that was in Oregon. Oh, the picture below. And this top picture was in the Similkameen. We used a little bit of riprap to try and key in the large woody debris and keep it a little bit more stable. But again, this is kind of a really calculated procedure that you have to go through, because it's really common for riprap or for large woody debris to get washed away, which is what it does. But if you want it to stay somewhere, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has really specific calculations based on stem diameter and weight and tree species and density and all that stuff to help you build a woody debris structure that might stay in place a little bit longer. So with anything that we do in restoration, this is not permanent, and we understand that going into it. We know that we're just trying to get a process kick-started, and we're not expecting this woody debris pile to be around forever, but hopefully it'll come loose. And in the Similkameen, there's enough room in the lower Chappaqua where if it does come loose, it will be incorporated somewhere else as woody debris habitat, and we're not looking at like jamming up a dam or a bridge or anything like that. Okay, and one more. This is in an old agricultural field, again in the Similkameen. So in the top left photo, there's a little yellow line. That was an irrigation canal that was dug in the 70s. And if you can see the photo below it, so the photo to the left middle, the water table was lowered substantially. So before the channel was dug, this whole field was used as a hay field. But then afterwards, the irrigation just became too, like the intent was to help farming, but it actually dried out the land and it became too hard to get water back onto the land. So the hay field was given up. So the landholder in this case was like, hey, I wouldn't mind haying the field again. It's been decades. but also like there's no riparian area in the riparian habitat in the area. So can we get it back? Can we do the mix? So that's what we did. We closed off the ditch, which backwatered the water all through its historic trail here, and it raised up the groundwater and the surface water, and he can hay his field again much more easily. You can use flood irrigation as opposed to like a pump driven system. Right. And last is not necessarily on the ground, but it's just thinking about how we can change our management practices. So the example here, this kind of shows a cow. Cows are not necessarily the worst thing. So a lot of times we approach cattle with, no, get out of the land, you're destroying it. But if you rotate cattle at an intense enough frequency, you control where they go into a water system, they can actually, they don't have to destroy everything. So it's just thinking again about how we can work with the land as opposed to just imposing our will on it. So there's a couple of different topics in here and I can go through, but I also want to listen to Eric's presentation. So we can revisit that later. But in closing, I was super fortunate enough to attend a recent talk by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she's a member of the Potawatomi Nation and also a Western science researcher looking at traditional ecological knowledge and land-people relations and how that relates to restoration. But she ended her talk with a call to action, and I just wanted to share that with you. So she has suggested to all of us to live as though we are grateful for the rivers, but also so the rivers are grateful for us. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Christina.
Wow, thank you. That's an amazing call to action. That's sort of a bit, almost takes your breath away. And this was fantastic. I know I have a number of questions that I will try to hold on. Is there anybody that has any quick questions that they want to ask before we move this to Eric? And like I said, that we're going to have that time for questions afterwards as well. So I don't see anything. So I think, Eric, let's start with your presentation. And I'm just going to see, I'm going to stop Natasha from sharing, and then we'll open it up to Eric. And so as Eric is setting it up, I know that Randy made an interesting comment in the chat box here. There was a large, big woody debris project done in Pope and Talbot on Trappin Creek back in the 90s. So I'm wondering, Randy, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about that. Is it still there? One of the neat comments that Natasha spoke about was how a lot of these large woody debris projects aren't long-term. So it'd be interesting to see if you could speak maybe after Eric's presentation on how that project's doing now. Okay, Eric, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you. I can see your screen. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. Today, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to who the provincial fisheries management staff that work in the boundary are, and then a bit of an overview of small lakes management program, and then we'll get into some aquatic invasive species issues. So to begin, I just want to take a few minutes to introduce you to who the provincial fisheries management staff in the boundary are and where we fit into the province's organizational structure. So we're part of the Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development, which is a very large ministry. And this is really just a small snip of the org chart that contains the fisheries program. So we are part of the 7th area, Thompson Okanagan Resource Management Program. And there are actually 6 components therein, which are geospatial services, integrated stewardship, research, fisheries, wildlife, and ecosystems. And under the fisheries management program, we have 2 offices, one out of Penticton, which kind of is responsible for managing Region 8, and one out of Kamloops, which is primarily responsible for Region 3. So this is Tara White. Tara is our senior fisheries biologist. So she oversees all of our regional fisheries issues, and she also has a strong expertise in habitat restoration. Myself, I am the stock assessment biologist for the region. So I tend to work more with fish stock population modeling and data analysis. But I also kind of stray into a lot of other areas, and I do also work in water management. Specifically, I manage 16 dams that the Fish and Wildlife section owns. And this is Amanda Turner, and Amanda is our small lakes biologist. So right now she's working on kind of all things small lakes oriented. Okay, so this next section is an overview of our small lakes management program and also kind of the recent work that's been done. The small lakes fisheries support the vast majority of all the recreational angling effort that occurs in the Thompson-Okanagan region. So in Region 8, there are approximately 300 small lakes fisheries, and these are generally assigned to one of 4 different management classifications. These are regional, family, quality, and trophy. And in terms of the angling experience that you would expect at the different classifications, as you move from left to right, you tend to see declining catch rates and increasing fish size. So for regional and family fisheries where we have more inexperienced anglers and youth anglers, we want to provide the opportunity to catch a lot of fish, but maybe with less focus on larger fish. And then for more experienced anglers, they tend to kind of orient towards the quality and trophy fisheries where the catch rates can be a little lower, but you do tend to see larger fish. So for each of these different management classifications, we use different strategies to try and ultimately meet the goal of providing a real diversity of angling opportunities for all the different types of anglers that we have. So we have both stocked fisheries and also those that are supported through natural recruitment, natural spawning. And some of the highest quality fisheries that we have, unfortunately, have to be maintained through winter aeration systems. And this is because in our part of the world, it's actually quite challenging to find lakes that have the productivity to grow large fish, but don't winter kill. And this is really kind of a function of usually when we're talking productivity, it's a function of mean depth and then also dissolved solids. So it's water chemistry paired with bathymetry. And the most productive systems tend to be quite shallow on average, and they have very productive water chemistry. But this also means that they're prone to those winter kill events. Okay, so this is just a bit of an overview of how our small lakes management process works for managing individual fisheries. So 2 big pieces of information that we really need are what does the fish stock look like? And in order to achieve this, we use a standardized gill netting protocol. And that allows us to obtain information on size distribution, growth, and sex and maturity. And the second piece of information we need is angler effort. So how many people are using the fishery and how much total angling effort are they exerting on it? And in order to estimate that, we use aerial boat counts. So we actually have numerous flight lines. They generally have 80 to 90 lakes on them. And across the year, we'll fly those 20 times. So we've spent quite a few years developing this flight line model. And it takes into account not only the boat counts, but also the time, weather, day type, and a number of other factors. And it's actually really difficult to produce these effort estimates with tight confidence intervals, but the model does allow us to detect changes of plus or minus 30% for an individual lake. And it also allows us to track the regional and provincial trends. So the next step is we take that stock composition data and the angler effort estimates, and we analyze it, and we determine if the fishery is performing well. And if we find that it is not performing to our expectations, then there are really 2 main tools that we have to manipulate. And these are the stocking prescription, so the number, strain, and size of fish that we put into the lake, and then also the angling regulations that anglers have to abide by. So that's just, that's just kind of a general overview of how we manage these individual lakes on the landscape to try and meet specific objectives. Okay, so one of the things that I actually like the most about my job is when I have the opportunity to get out on the landscape and connect with our stakeholders. And a lot of the time this means anglers. And for small lakes, the most common concern that I hear is that the fish size is declining, kind of in their favorite fisheries and also just kind of across the board. So it's actually really difficult to nail down a single definitive factor that's causing this fish size to decline. But I think for most lakes, it's a function of 2 parameters. And there's definitely some speculation on my part here, because we simply don't have the historical biological data that you'd really need to determine exactly how these systems have changed over the last 80 years. And really, we do have a lot of fisheries that have been stocked since the 1940s, and some of them even earlier. So just as a brief aside, fish stocking is actually one of the earliest examples of any type of fish and wildlife management within that kind of context of modern Western science. And in the past, it really was approached with a certain reckless abandon. So we put a lot of fish into places just because we could. And now we're really seeing the consequences of that as we struggle to manage those populations, some of which have had really significant impacts on wild stock. And it's common that we don't have any options to basically get rid of them. So I'm a very strong supporter of increased accountability, enhanced risk assessment, and also just a more strategic and precautionary approach to fish stocking as we move forward. So going back to these two factors that I think contribute to declining fish size in a lot of these fisheries, the first is natural recruitment. So up until 25 years ago, the province stocked diploid or reproductively viable trout into most of our small lakes fisheries. And in a lot of places, as you would kind of expect, these diploid stocks found natural spawning habitat, and the density of the stock wasn't controlled by the number of fish that we put in, but rather the level of natural recruitment that was occurring. So like a lot of fish species, rainbow trout display a really high degree of density dependent growth. So as the stock density increases, the fish size decreases, and that leaves us with what a lot of people refer to as a stunted fishery. So lots of fish, but very small fish. And this can really be quite a slow process. So particularly when you start to consider, climate, environmental events, and water management practices, it can result in significant variations in those recruitment levels between years. So, it might take 15 or 20 years to get to that point, but we have a lot of small lakes fisheries where this has been the end result. And the second factor is diminishing productivity. So we took a lot of small lakes that had no native large body fish species, and we either established a naturally viable fish stock or we stocked them persistently for decades, so year after year. And really, in my mind, it's not surprising that the overall productivity, and in this context, when I talk about productivity, what I'm really talking about is the biomass that's available in those lower trophic levels, so primarily invertebrates. And it's really not surprising that the productivity has diminished over time. So when you combine these two things, you end up with these fisheries with high densities of small fish, which are really minimally attractive to anglers. And a lot of the time, we don't have any management options to try and manipulate them. Okay, so in 2019, in order to attempt, or at least partially address this issue of declining angling quality, we did a detailed review of our stocking program. So there was three main factors that we looked at. The first was overstocking. So this would include fisheries where we're stocking on top of that natural recruitment, fisheries where the productivity has declined and we can no longer support the historic biomass of fish, and then also fisheries where we've seen notable declines in angler harvest. And this last one is quite interesting because there seems to have been a real shift in BC's fishing culture away from harvest and towards catch and release angling practices. And I think that shift is influenced by a wide array of kind of shifting social values. And I certainly won't say that I understand it fully. I think it's quite complex as angler behavior and really, understanding any human behavior really is. So in the past, our stocking prescriptions were intended to provide ample opportunity for harvest, but with less people keeping fish, we're at a point where we need to really try to adapt to that changing angler behavior. The second factor was natural recruitment. So I think I've explained that there are a lot of fisheries where this was occurring, and there were definitely some where we were stocking on top of this natural recruitment. So we were actually making the angling quality worse through some of our management practices. And then thirdly is strain selection. So we actually stock a number of different strains of rainbow trout, and they tend to have different strengths and weaknesses in terms of how they behave and how they adapt to certain environmental conditions. And that would include things like water temperature, pH, and then also other, competitive fish species that occur in those systems. So the end result was a change in stocking density or strain selection for 20 lakes. And there was actually 77 lakes where we totally suspended the stocking. And because we're kind of resource limited, some of these changes really were supported by desktop exercises and assumptions rather than the more concrete data that we would preferably have. So what we'll do is we'll continue to verify that information over time And I suspect there will probably be some fisheries where stocking is resumed if the fishery cannot be supported by natural recruitment, or if it isn't occurring at all. And I do want to kind of stress that if anyone on the line is an angler and is in the habit of reviewing the stocking reports, I want to emphasize that the stocking suspensions are not an indication that we want to remove these fisheries. What they really represent is an effort to improve angling quality and to be more strategic in how we allocate our finite resources. And I'm also expecting from this process that there will probably be some lakes where we've stopped stocking. The fish stock is not persistent, but there just isn't a big enough angler base to kind of create a demand to maintain that fishery. So I would expect that some of these will go back to being going back to being fishless lakes, which I think, on the landscape overall is a real benefit in terms of, maintaining biodiversity and total ecosystem health, because some of these stocked fish populations really do exert some negative impacts on our native species. Okay, so this last slide on small lakes is basically just showing the 7 lakes that we've done assessment work on the last 3 years. And I'm not going to go into the lake specific results, but if anyone is interested, I am more than happy to connect with them at another time. Okay. So that brings us to aquatic invasive species. I find these days that when someone asks me to identify what the most kind of pressing issues are in fisheries management in BC, aquatic invasive species is invariably at the top of the list. These species threaten our native fish and their ecosystems, and I think they've really become a consideration in almost all of our business lines and projects. So, anything that we work on these days, it really does seem like AIS is an issue of consideration. And I feel really strongly that because of the scale and the nature of the issue, this is one of these areas where it's absolutely crucial that we coordinate and collaborate really closely with all levels of government, First Nations, and also NGOs. So I think probably some of the best known invasives are the mussels and clams, and they're a very significant threat, but because the initiatives that are associated with them are really managed by the BC Conservation Officer Service and also the Ministry of Environment's invasive fauna unit, I'm just going to kind of focus on the invasive fish species. So I generally think of these fish species in 2 broad categories, one of them being game fish and the other one is aquarium fish. So there's some notable differences between the 2 in terms of how they got here and continue to spread, and also what strategies are most effective in trying to stop that spread and ideally eradicate them. So for game fish, they were most commonly introduced into our waters with the intention of producing recreational fisheries. And this was done not only by members of the public, but also by the province. So when you look at bass and perch populations throughout the region, there's a lot of those populations that were initially established by the government. So I think that looking back, there was a lot of good intentions in terms of expanding the diversity of angling opportunities. And at other times that we were also using these species as biological controls, introducing one thing to address something else that has been introduced. And historically, I would say that this has almost never turned out well. So I think in hindsight, we've made some pretty devastating decisions that we can't undo. But I like to think that our thought process is now on track and that we're trying to work together to try and address some of these issues. Oh, this does not want to advance. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I would like to touch a bit on policy, and particularly around what we're doing with populations of non-Indigenous game fish that have been around for a long time, that a lot of anglers use, and a lot of people enjoy them. So about 2 years ago, the province recognized this as one of our pressing priorities, and we updated the policy on invasive fish species, and that includes these long-standing AIS fisheries that have really significant recreational and economic value. So the province's policy position is that we do not promote recreational fisheries for AIS, and we do not support the future development of those angling opportunities. So this means that we do not engage in habitat enhancement projects, and we do not implement any protective angling regulations for these species. So that would be something like closing angling during the spawning period for bass. And where there are options to stop the spread or to eradicate them, we do make every effort to do so, but it's often very challenging. Kind of that second category, what I think of as aquarium fish, these are things like goldfish and rosy red minnows, and we focus more of our attention on public messaging around not releasing these fish, rather than the more kind of complex issue of trying to apply policy and regulations to change people's behavior. Because really these introductions are, the source is usually, you know, a place of ignorance where people don't realize that dumping out Jimmy's goldfish is going to result in an established population that has real impacts on the native ecosystem, but that is what we end up with. So it's not people trying to create angling opportunities by illegally introducing fish. It's people not understanding the consequence of their actions. So in terms of actions on the ground, our response to new introductions is to close the fishery entirely. And this will usually be until a time that the risk has been assessed. We've explored the relevant options around containment and eradication. And there are a lot of scenarios where eradication simply isn't possible. And if there's a continued risk of the stock being used as a source population for further introductions, it may actually just remain closed to angling indefinitely. So, and then the other scenario we have is situations where we have a long-standing AIS stock, and we believe the risk of further spread and the ecological impacts is fairly low. And these we will manage as a regulated fishery. And we actually spent a lot of time kind of debating the language in this part of the policy. We started out with tolerated fishery, but where we landed was regulated. So some good examples of this would be kind of all of the Okanagan Valley large lakes where we have bass and perch populations. Christina Lake's another good example. And then in your neck of the woods, Arlington Lakes and the perch population there. So in conjunction with the updated policy, we did also change our approach to the angling regulations for invasives. So initially the plan was to adopt the same approach across the province, but due to the diversity of fisheries and kind of issues that occur between regions, we never really got to that point of alignment. So where we landed in the Thompson Okanagan is that fishing for and retaining invasive fish is prohibited with the exception of specific water bodies, and those are listed in the fisheries regulation. So the idea here is to continue allowing anglers to use those long-standing fisheries if there's minimal risk, but also remove the incentive for people to move fish. So if you illegally stock a lake with an invasive species, you will not legally be able to use it. So I think the logic on this is sound, but it's one of these things where it's been very difficult to get anglers to buy into it, especially when you have a situation where, you know, you start talking about closing down someone's favorite fishery because someone dumped a bucket of perch into it. So yeah, it's really easy for the angling community to look at this as kind of a punitive action against that community as a whole, when really what we're trying to do is just remove that incentive for people to continue doing this. And we're really at a point where with these illegal introductions where we have to take a hard line. And unfortunately, the kind of casualty there is that loss of recreational angling opportunity. Okay, so moving on to the issues that are specific for the boundary. Over the last 4 years, we received numerous reports of largemouth bass in the Kettle River. And this is concerning because we know that these type of species can have really devastating impacts on salmonids. So unfortunately, these reports were also from above Cascade Falls. That's kind of disappointing because it indicates that the fish were introduced intentionally rather than having migrated from south of the border. And it also means that there are really no natural barriers in place to prevent further spread. So we've also had some reports of smallmouth bass, but none of those have actually been confirmed. So in terms of our response, in 2019, we began eDNA sampling in a number of locations on the river. So for anyone that's not familiar with this technique, we basically collect water samples from the environment. So in this case, that's the river itself. We filter out any of the genetic material, and then we compare this to the genetic profile of the species that we're interested in. So it's a very cool technique, and it continues to develop, but it also has quite a few limitations. So one of those being that you have to, I'm sorry, a call came through there. One of the limitations being that you have to have a target species you're looking for. You can't simply analyze a sample and expect it to kind of magically tell you every species whose DNA is present. And there's also a lot of environmental factors that affect detection. So these are things like temperature, flow, and seasonal changes in your target species behavior and distribution. So, and probably one of the most kind of disappointing current limitations is that it doesn't tell you anything about relative abundance. So it'll tell you if something is there or has been there, but it can't tell you what that relative abundance is. So right now, I think it's a really powerful tool to be used in conjunction with other sampling techniques, but it's really difficult to come to any conclusions based on just those eDNA results. So in 2019, we completed a week of snorkel surveys in the reaches where we'd received bass reports. So just like it sounds, basically 5 people floating down the river with masks and snorkels and just noting what fish species they see. So interestingly, we did not detect any bass in the snorkel survey or the eDNA results, even though we had confirmed reports from anglers, some of who had actually produced the fish. So moving forward, I think we're going to continue with the eDNA sampling, and we've also installed a lot of invasive species alert signage that we're hoping will help kind of maintain the dialogue with the local community and encourage people to continue reporting when they do find these species. The second issue that I'd like to touch on is northern pike in the Kettle River and Christina Lake. So in 2017, we received a report that the milfoil divers in Christina Lake had observed northern pike. And at the time, there was really no easy way to assess the credibility of the report. So it was, it was one of those things where we suspected that they were probably right, but we just couldn't be sure. So the Christina Lake Stewardship Society has really been leading the charge on this issue, and I think Susie is on the call with us. And they've done an excellent job of organizing targeted angling events for the last 2 springs, or I guess not this last spring, but 2 before, which on a positive note did not actually produce any pike. And then in 2019, the Stewardship Society received additional information about a kind of an old 2017 angling report, and it was completed kind of with a photo and passed along to us. And at that point, we kind of decided that this probably is a credible report.
So Eric, I'm just going to cut in for just a second because we're getting very close to the 11:30 point here.
Sure.
So I wanted to say that as we know, we're recording this webinar, and for anyone that needs to leave right at 11:30, this will be posted up on the RDKB watershed website, and that address, you can link it through the rdkb.com website, and you can finish off the presentation.
Sure. I just got about 2 minutes, I think.
Yeah, no problem. And I just know that there's going to be a couple of questions afterwards. So I just wanted to put that out to people that if anyone does have to leave, know that you'll still be able to get the rest of it. So thank you very much. Continue, Eric.
Thank you. Okay, so at this point, we were feeling pretty confident that pike had been detected in Christina Lake, and we implemented what's called the province's early detection and rapid response procedures. So fortunately, we were able to partner with the Ministry of Environment, the Christina Lake Stewardship Society, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and then within that, the Colville Confederated Tribes, and also a number of other partners. And the intent there was really to start sharing information and to allocate resources on the ground. So in 2019, we conducted eDNA sampling for northern pike at a number of sites, actually in Christina Lake, kind of down in the southern portion, and also in Christina Creek, and where the creek meets the Kettle River. So all of these samples did come back negative. And during the same period, the Okanagan Nation Alliance conducted electrofishing and gill netting surveys on Christina Lake. Excuse me. And they actually did not capture any pike. Sorry, I was a bit behind on that slide. So you can see in this image that these are the sampling locations for the eDNA. Okay, so the Colville Confederated Tribes are also kind of investing significant resources along with ONA towards pike distribution suppression efforts. And some of this, for the Colville tribes, this is on the US side of the border. And they actually did have a positive detection 10 kilometers from Canadian waters in 2018. So you can see that that is the red dot at the top of the map here. And I think really, to me, it's reasonable to assume that northern pike have entered the Kettle River system, and that we need to continue monitoring the situation and consider what suppression or eradication options are available. So fortunately, the Stewardship Society has secured funding for a barrier feasibility study in Christina Creek, So the idea there being to try and figure out whether or not we can stop pike that have moved up the Kettle River, up Christina Creek, whether we can actually stop them from moving into the lake and establishing there. So, and I think that that's going to be a really valuable next step in determining where we're going to continue to allocate resources. And then this is actually the photo from that angling report. So I've showed it to quite a few people that that live in that area, and they all seem pretty confident that that is in fact Christina Lake. So then next steps, we're going to continue to monitor with eDNA. We're going to also maintain those partnerships that we've built with the ONA and other groups for other detection methods. And we're going to provide whatever support we can to the stewardship societies, feasibility studies, and whatever other future work they take on. And as with so many fisheries issues, but I think even more so with AIS, the public education outreach component is really invaluable. And that is what I have for you. I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And I know that in terms of, that public, the communication component has just been a big part of really that education for fisheries and riparian and all wild watershed components. So we do have a couple of questions. And so coming in from the chat box, just so that I don't miss that. Can the habitat in the Kettle River support a significant bass population? I guess that's going to be going to you, Eric.
I would say that it could. And actually, one of the things that was surprising about the bass issue was that the confirmed detections were all for largemouth bass. And I would actually say that the bulk of the habitat in the Kettle looks more conducive to smallmouth bass for me, even though we haven't actually had any detections. So I guess, yeah, the answer to the question is yes. I think it can support a pretty significant population.
Oh, wow. And is there anything that locals can do to catch, trap invasive fish species such as shiners in lakes where we live? So it's coming in from Randy.
For species like shiners, we've done some work on large scale removal, and in general, it is not effective. So I would suggest that the biggest thing that members of the public can do is to report. So to provide us with information on what they see and where. But in terms of kind of going out on your own to try and actually impact those populations, it would be extremely difficult.
Where would they report? Who would they contact?
The RAP line, our provincial report of poacher line.
Perfect.
Yeah, and there's also an app for reporting invasive species through the province.
Oh.
Yeah, I can provide some links for distribution if you like.
Yeah. I think that'd be really good. Something that I know we should probably just have on our website here. So we've got a question in from Corey. Does the role of the riparian areas shift based on the watercourse type? So example, Natasha's fantastic presentation had more of a focus on rivers. Does the same information hold true for shorelines along lakes? Interesting question. Pass it over to Natasha.
Yeah, so it does. And it depends on the type of vegetation too. So, I mean, there's underlying themes. So lakes also are stabilized by their riparian vegetation. The process that develops the riparian vegetation in a lake is slightly different because you don't have flow through. You have more of like an impact, like a wave action that's kind of shifting the margins of the lake. So that's where the dynamism comes in there. But there are like many of the factors are still the same. So lake margins still filter water, they still filter air. They still, let's see here. My brain is shot from, they do so much, I can't focus on one. There's the water filter, carbon sequestration is definitely one. They still put large woody debris inputs into the lake margins. And there still is interaction between like groundwater and surface water. So the mechanism by which it gets there is different, but the roles are kind of similar. But then you go kind of a level deeper and emergent vegetation has a little bit different role than large woody debris. So large woody debris is kind of, you're looking at your trees to grow big, old habitat. You're looking at them to fall down. You're looking at them to shade the area. And then emergent vegetation is more, It's often like breeding habitat for amphibians and various fish species and that type of thing. So
Thanks. We had a couple of questions that came into me before, as we were setting up the presentation or the webinar. And so and this would be going out to both you and Eric, sorry, Natasha and Eric. This is me looking at videos. What are your thoughts on impacts from motorboats, outboard motors, and sort of those skimming jet boats on water systems, specifically, of course, in the Boundary region or Okanagan watersheds? And are there certain organisms that are more impacted than others? And I guess, and the question sort of also ties into ORV, so off-road vehicles and fording streams. So just sort of looking at some of that human impact and how that might affect fisheries and the riparian areas.
Yeah, so I've actually, that's interesting that this came up because we've had some conversation with the Conservation Officer Service around kind of conflicts between different user groups on the Kettle River recently. And one of the things that we seem to be seeing is an increase in jet boat traffic. So aside from the kind of public conflict piece, I would say that during high flows, the boat traffic is probably not a real significant issue. But when we get into these periods of extreme low water, and a lot of those jet boats, can draft in only 3 or 4 inches. So even when we get into these low water conditions, they're still accessible for those boats. I would say that, yeah, there are definitely impacts. As soon as you start displacing sediment, you're affecting invert communities. If you're operating in times where there are actually fish eggs present, there could be issues with not only, blowing them out downstream, but also covering them with sediment. And, in periods where we have congregations of fish kind of in like cold water refugia areas, when the rivers drop, I think there's definitely potential for boats to kind of distribute those fish into less ideal habitat where they're going to be kind of exposed to high temperatures and low water conditions. So yeah, I think absolutely we need to be cognizant of trying to regulate those activities.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Eric. I would add, I guess, more of a small lakes or perhaps like a backwater area in a creek that might be affected. Well, I guess a river if you're having a boat. But there's, depending on the size and the depth of the lake also. So for example, Cal Lake is one of our lakes in the Okanagan. And there is a lot of boat activity. However, the boats are asked to stay kind of in the middle and the deeper sections because when they go to the shoreline closer, they kick up sediment that impacts drinking water. So it's also like a human impact that we don't want to see for the water quality in that respect. And then another example, Basso Lake in the South Okanagan is protected from boats for the reason that it's a very small lake and there's a lot of shore breeding birds and amphibians that use the lake margins. And Basso isn't typically a lake that experiences a lot of wave action. So if you were to look at something like a large Okanagan lake, the shores are kind of adapted to constant wave action and it's built a system to deal with that. But in a small lake like Basso, lots of activity would create more erosive wave action that the system's not used to.
Wow, yeah, so a big impacts. One of the other questions that came through, and Eric was talking a lot about that sort of invasive species, and I know we spoke a little bit about it before the webinar, was we have spoken about the Cascade Falls as their restriction point for the salmon. So if salmon move, if somehow they manage to get up above the Cascade Falls, would they be considered invasive? So I guess that's sort of the question, speaking a bit more to that definition of invasive and also, I guess, maybe a little bit looking at what the impacts of something like that would be.
Yeah, as we were kind of chatting about before, I think there's a big unknown in that question, and that's as to whether or not upstream of the falls actually was part of the natural range. But when we start talking about things like Chinook and steelhead, they're amazingly resistant to velocity. And even, if you're standing on that bridge looking down at the falls, it seems insane that anything could come up. But I think we just don't know for sure. Yeah, and I mean, if they historically had occurred above that point, then I certainly would not consider them invasive. And I'd actually have a hard time considering them invasive at all because they're in that native system and native watershed. So, in terms of ecosystem impacts, incredibly complex and a lot of unknowns, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. One of the comments talking about the wetlands, sorry, in the riparian areas. I think the other thing that I've really noticed is that difference in width of the riparian area based off different systems, and so that could be soil types and it could be bioclimatic zoning information. How have you noticed sort of that change in that hyperaric zone in terms of and the effect of the nutrients based off width of the riparian, or is it sort of more just the environment of what would sort of hit the natural system for that area?
That's a good question. There's so much diversity in the natural system that it, like some riparian zones are naturally very thin, and like in, say, for example, canyon systems. Mm-hmm. We know our group isn't involved in direct measuring and quantifying of nutrients. However, if you look at things that indicate that type of interaction, you can see historically and based on stories from the knowledge keepers and the elders about what activities occurred where, you can kind of pick pieces of that information there. So I think it's really site specific, depending. Yeah, it's such a vague answer. I think it really depends on where you sit in the landscape to be able to kind of pull that information out.
How would you go about, like, if you got into an area that, let's say, been fairly degraded over time through human interactions, human activities, what would you do in terms of figuring out maybe how wide that riparian area should be?
If we have the resources for people who have been there, I would definitely talk to the people. That would be a good start. And it's not just the like the Syilx, right? Or whoever's territory you're in. It's people who have grown up here, born and raised, and who have had relatives here, and who have experienced various like agriculture or different activities in a land base. So that would be the one start. The second one, you can usually see through ortho images changes in the landscape over time, and you can pick out like changes in vegetation, and same with on the land. Like I am not the trained eye. I've only been like 12 years in this, so I definitely know a tiny piece of the puzzle. But typically, if you have a bit of a background, you can see in a landscape, you can kind of see hints again of the vegetation or pooling, or like it's harder obviously in a city because everything's been flattened and built with concrete. Yeah, exactly. But there's still areas, flooding still does occur. And the biggest factor that we go by with river restoration in our type of systems, for like this would be the regional Kootenai boundary and the Okanagan as well. There's math to rivers, so you can tell how far a meander length should be, if it's braiding, if it's wandering, if there's distributaries. So there's very specific math that you can kind of get a start to. So all these factors you kind of got to play into for that. And then in Penticton, another thing we looked at was the gravel composition historically. So we're super lucky. I don't recall if it was the province or the government of Canada, but somebody had done gravel surveys in the Okanagan River kind of around the time of channelization. So we could tell based on the gravel size what the river might have looked like in the middle sections. And then you could deduce like the upper and lower section of the Penticton Channel was more wetland or riparian. And then we could tell kind of the ratio theoretically of like sockeye to kokanee spawning. And we followed that target and combined it with stories of the elders and knowledge keepers and community members about the fish and the vegetation and that type of stuff. So a lot of people and gathering whatever resources you can in that specific spot.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate both of you and the time and the information that you've shared. If I'll sort of put it out if there's any other questions. We're hit the 11:45, so I think we're pretty close to wrapping this up. And I really appreciate it. There's so much that, that we can gather, even just listening, and it's starting conversations and adding to discussions. And I so appreciate the information and the knowledge that you've been able to provide us today. So thank you from the RDKB and from the folks over here on the webinar. And thank you to all of you that have stuck it out till this point here. Really appreciate it. And thank you for the questions and the comments that have been coming through. I know that there's a lot of information that we still is an unknown out there, but this has been a pretty great start.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.